Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Green, and I'm excited to talk about my work co-authored with Yiling Chen. Algorithmic risk assessments can alter human decision-making processes in high-stakes government contexts. One significant development in public policy over the last decade has been the increased use of algorithmic tools to inform consequential decisions about individuals. These include risk assessments used in the criminal justice system, in the child welfare system, and more. As much as these tools are often heralded as important signs of progress, more often they have been the causes of various injustices. It is therefore essential to interrogate the promises and effects of algorithms like risk assessments. This paper contributes to this cause by scrutinizing a central dimension of how risk assessments influence public policy, their effect on human decision-making. A central selling point for risk assessments among both policymakers and academics is that they make more accurate predictions of risk than human decision makers. However, predictions are quite different than the types of decisions that government officials often have to make. Many decisions involve balancing competing goals, such as in the case of pretrial decision-making, on the one hand, limiting the risk that a defendant will fail to appear in court or will be rearrested, while on the other hand, prioritizing the liberty of that defendant by ensuring that they are released. The National Institute of Justice, for instance, notes that how this balance is struck has enormous implications. Effectively, the balancing act that goes on within these types of decisions results in the effective implementation or determines the effective implementation of public policy. So when we scrutinize an algorithm, it's not enough to just look at how the tool performs on its own, nor is it sufficient to consider how the algorithm influences human predictions. Thoroughly evaluating the impacts of risk assessments requires considering not just how the algorithm influences human predictions, but actually how it influences human decision-making. So that leads to the central question of this study: do risk assessments alter human decision-making processes? As I mentioned before, this decision-making process involves people balancing risk with other factors to make a decision. A shift in the decision-making process means that risk is being weighed differently as a factor in decision-making, which amounts effectively to a shift in public policy. Policymakers and others advocating for risk assessments assert that these tools merely improve human predictions without altering how they factor risk into their decisions. In other words, proponents claim that as long as decision makers are granted autonomy and discretion over final decisions, providing public servants with accurate risk predictions will lead these individuals to make better decisions. Yet despite being central to arguments for adopting public sector algorithms, this assumption has not been rigorously tested. A key point to note here is that what we're looking for is not simply that the risk assessment alters the decisions that people make, but actually the underlying decision-making process, which means that we're accounting for not just the decision, but also how the risk assessment is altering people's underlying predictions of risk that they're factoring into those decisions. Our study operated in 3 stages. First, we developed risk assessments that we could use in experiments. Using historical data, we developed risk assessment models for 2 settings: pretrial detention and government home improvement loans. We then ran experiments with over 2,000 participants from Amazon Mechanical Turk, having them make either predictions or decisions about individuals who were either criminal defendants or applicants for government home improvement loans. So why study lay people? Certainly because we're looking at Amazon Mechanical Turk workers, our results do not reflect the precise behaviors of experts making real decisions in practice. Although the gold standard is data on how experts use algorithms in practice, knowledge of how lay people interact with an algorithm can contribute to algorithm design and public policy. Studies with lay people present some significant practical advantages. They can be conducted quickly, with many participants, with precisely controlled experimental procedures, and most importantly, before implementing an algorithm into any real-world context. Furthermore, evidence suggests that results of these studies could align with real-world outcomes and complement studies of expert decision-making in practice. Notably, experimental studies have found that both judges and financial professionals exhibit many of the same behaviors as lay people when making decisions, including in many of their interactions with algorithms. So such experiments can inform and complement more detailed studies of practitioner interactions with algorithms. The goal is not by any means to replace those other studies. Finally, we then turn to analyzing the participant behaviors from our experiments to determine whether being shown the risk assessment altered decision-making as a function of perceived risk. So let's see what we found. First, as expected, we did find that showing the risk assessment improved the accuracy of human predictions. However, looking at decision-making complicates the story. First, by analyzing participant behaviors in our experiments, we found that showing the risk assessment altered human decision-making processes in both settings. In the pretrial setting, the risk assessment made participants more sensitive to increases in risk when making decisions. And in the loan setting, the risk assessment made participants more risk-averse at all levels of risk. Interestingly, the participants did not recognize that the risk assessment had altered their behavior in any of these manners. We then used simulations to estimate the impacts of these shifts on the decision-making processes. In the pretrial setting, we found that this shift increased the racial disparity in detention rates by almost 2%. And in the loan setting, this shift reduced the number of loans granted by over 8%. In sum, we found that the change in the decision-making processes counteracted the potential benefits of improving human prediction accuracy. In other words, improving human predictions with a risk assessment did not actually improve the quality of decisions because unexpectedly, the risk assessment also changed how people factor risk into their decisions. So these results have several policy implications. They challenge the assumption that presenting risk assessments will improve human decision-making, and they demonstrate the potential limits and harms of efforts to improve public policy by incorporating algorithms into multifaceted policy decisions. If these observed changes were to occur in real-world settings, they would be notable for several reasons. First, implementing algorithms could generate unexpected shifts in policy and jurisprudence. A systematic increase in the salience of risk in decision-making would amount to a shift in the normative balancing act that comprises public policy in domains such as pretrial adjudication. Second, a greater emphasis on risk in decision-making is likely to exacerbate racial disparities. Since risk is unevenly distributed across social groups, basing decisions more heavily on risk and being more risk-averse is likely to harm already disadvantaged communities. And third, these effects are likely to arise without any deliberation or oversight. They would arise as the consequence of an algorithm's unintended influence on human decision-making processes rather than through a democratic policymaking process, and would likely not even be recognized by the decision makers themselves. So these findings suggest a need to reform how we design and regulate algorithms. We can't just focus on algorithm accuracy, as many recent policies propose, and is often the focus of algorithm design. We must also study how human decision makers interact with algorithms. If we don't, regulations and design evaluations will provide a false sense of security in governments adopting algorithms. In other words, before any decision to adopt an algorithm, there must be evidence that people collaborate with the algorithm as desired and that the algorithm actually improves human decision-making. We should put more emphasis on running experiments with both lay people and practitioners before an algorithm is adopted to gain evidence about how these tools actually affect outcomes. And here, experiments with lay people can provide a valuable approach for attaining preliminary insights about human algorithm collaborations, which can then inform more intensive studies with practitioners and different mechanisms that might be implemented to improve human algorithm collaborations in practice. And even once an algorithm is adopted in practice, it will be worthwhile to subject those interactions to ongoing monitoring to evaluate how these interactions arise in practice and how they might evolve over time. In sum, it's necessary to more rigorously scrutinize how algorithms influence human decision-making processes. Before government agencies implement algorithms, they must have rigorous evidence regarding what impacts these tools are likely to generate and democratic deliberation supporting those impacts. Thank you.